The phone rang at exactly 3:47 a.m. on September 15, 1957. Frank Costello, the most powerful man in New York's underworld, sat behind his mahogany desk in his penthouse office overlooking Central Park. The call he was about to make would change everything, not just for Bumpy Johnson, not just for Harlem, but for the entire power structure of organized crime in America. Costello's fingers drummed against the desk as he stared at a single manila folder. Inside were photographs, police reports, and intelligence gathered over 18 months. All of it focused on one man, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the man who had somehow made Harlem untouchable. What nobody knew, what the newspapers would never report, is that Frank Costello was about to make the most important phone call of his criminal career. And by morning, the rules of power in New York City would be rewritten forever. To understand why the most feared man in organized crime was losing sleep over Bumpy Johnson, you need to understand what Harlem represented in 1957. This wasn't just a neighborhood. It was an empire. The numbers racket alone generated over $50 million annually. That's nearly $500 million in today's money. And every penny of it flowed through systems that Bumpy Johnson controlled. But here's what made Costello nervous. It wasn't Bumpy's money. It was his method. Since 1952, when Bumpy returned from his first federal prison stint, he'd been building something the Italian families couldn't comprehend. A power structure that didn't rely on fear alone. When Harlem families couldn't make rent, Bumpy's organization covered it. When corrupt cops tried to shake down black-owned businesses, those cops found themselves transferred to desk jobs in Queens. When Italian soldiers attempted to muscle into Harlem's numbers game, they didn't end up in the river. They ended up in hospital beds, alive but educated. Frank Costello had spent his entire career understanding one simple principle: fear equals control. But Bumpy Johnson had proven something far more dangerous. Respect equals loyalty, and loyalty was harder to break than fear. The folder contained reports that kept Costello awake at night. In July 1957, 3 of Genevieve's family's best enforcers had attempted to take over a policy bank on 25th Street. They walked in with guns and threats. 2 hours later, they were found sitting on a bench in Marcus Garvey Park, unharmed but traumatized. Their weapons had been confiscated. Their wallets contained crisp $100 bills with a note: "Respect earns respect. Violence earns consequences." No shots fired, no blood spilled, but the message was unmistakable. What nobody understood was how Bumpy's network operated. It wasn't built like traditional crime families with rigid hierarchies and blood oaths. It functioned more like a sophisticated intelligence agency, combined with a community service organization. Every barbershop owner, every numbers runner, every taxi driver, every church deacon had a role to play. Information flowed up through dozens of channels. Decisions flowed down through carefully maintained relationships. August 1957. 5 corrupt NYPD detectives, all on Italian payrolls, attempted to raid Bumpy's main counting house. The raid was perfectly timed, perfectly planned, perfectly legal, except when they arrived, they found an empty building and a table with 5 envelopes. Each envelope contained copies of their own bank records, photographs of their own families, and detailed documentation of their illegal activities. The raid was called off. The detectives never spoke of what they'd found. But what those detectives didn't know was that their raid had been anticipated for 3 weeks. Bumpy's network included a cleaning lady who worked at the police precinct, a bartender who served drinks to police informants, and a numbers runner who happened to be the cousin of a police clerk. When Detective Sergeant Murphy made the initial request for surveillance equipment, that request passed through channels that reported directly to Bumpy Johnson's inner circle. The beauty of Bumpy's system wasn't just information gathering, it was information analysis. While other crime bosses reacted to threats, Bumpy predicted them. His organization maintained detailed files on every significant player in New York's power structure, not just criminals and cops, but judges, federal agents, prosecutors, politicians, business leaders, and union officials.
September 1957. Vito Genovese himself authorized a direct approach. His underboss, Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno, arranged a meeting with Bumpy at the Audubon Ballroom. The offer was simple: join the family structure, pay tribute, keep operating. Bumpy listened politely for 45 minutes. Then he asked one question: "What happens if I say no?" Fat Tony's answer was predictable: "You won't be saying anything." Bumpy Johnson stood up, straightened his tie, and said 5 words that would haunt Tony Salerno for years: "Then we have a problem." 3 days later, Fat Tony's favorite restaurant received a delivery. Inside the delivery boxes, instead of fresh fish, they found detailed federal tax records for every business Fat Tony owned, complete with evidence of unreported income dating back 8 years. The delivery also included a note: "Problems require solutions. But the restaurant delivery was just the visible part of a much larger operation. That same morning, Fat Tony's accountant received an anonymous call suggesting he review certain discrepancies in quarterly reports. Fat Tony's lawyer found a manila envelope on his desk, containing photocopies of FBI surveillance logs from the previous 6 months. Fat Tony's wife discovered a package on her doorstep containing photographs of her husband with his mistress, along with receipts from hotels and restaurants that weren't on his tax returns. Frank Costello understood what others missed. Bumpy Johnson wasn't playing by their rules because he was operating in a different game entirely. While the Italian families fought turf wars and body counts, Bumpy was building institutional power. He had judges, councilmen, federal agents, and IRS investigators in his network, not through bribes or threats, but through mutual benefit. The realization that changed everything came when Costello's own accountant, a man who handled the financial affairs of half of New York's crime families, made an offhand comment during their monthly meeting. "You know, Miss Costello, if you want to understand real power, you should study what Johnson's doing in Harlem. He's not just running numbers, he's running a shadow government." That comment led to 18 months of investigation. What Costello discovered terrified him more than any rival he'd ever faced. Bumpy Johnson had systematically identified every pressure point in New York's power structure. He knew which federal agents had gambling debts. He knew which judges had extramarital affairs. He knew which politicians had hidden financial interests. But here's what made it brilliant. He never used this information for blackmail. Instead, he used it to create mutually beneficial relationships. When federal agent Harrison Caldwell found himself $15,000 in debt to loan sharks, he didn't receive threats from Bumpy's organization. He received an anonymous envelope containing $15,000 in cash and a note. "Sometimes good men need help. No strings attached." 3 months later, when the FBI planned a raid on Harlem's numbers operations, Agent Caldwell happened to mention during a poker game that the timing might not be optimal due to ongoing federal investigations in adjacent jurisdictions. When Judge Patricia Morrison's son was arrested for possession charges that could destroy his future, she didn't receive visits from Bumpy's lawyers. Instead, she received a call from a prominent civil rights attorney who offered to represent her son pro bono. The attorney's fees were quietly paid by an anonymous donor. 2 years later, when cases involving Harlem residents appeared in Judge Morrison's courtroom, they were adjudicated with unusual fairness and consideration. When Assistant District Attorney Robert Chen's elderly mother needed expensive medical treatment, an anonymous benefactor covered the full cost of her care at Mount Sinai Hospital. 6 months later, when Chen's office was assigned to prosecute policy violations in Harlem, he found himself recommending minimum sentences and alternative programs rather than maximum penalties. This was Bumpy's genius. He wasn't building a criminal organization. He was building a parallel system of power that operated within the legal framework, while serving his community's interests. Every favor created obligation. Every kindness generated loyalty. Every solution to someone else's problem became leverage for future cooperation. But what made Costello's sleepless nights even worse was understanding how Bumpy's system sustained itself financially. Traditional crime families extracted money from communities through violence and intimidation. Bumpy's organization generated wealth by making communities more prosperous. When a Harlem business succeeded, Bumpy's organization benefited. When property values rose, his investments appreciated. When employment increased, his tax base expanded.
The numbers racket was just the foundation. Bumpy had investments in legitimate businesses across Manhattan, real estate holdings, restaurant partnerships, transportation companies, and import operations. Every enterprise was designed to strengthen Harlem's economic independence, while generating revenue for his organization. By September 1957, Frank Costello realized he was facing an existential threat, not to his immediate operations, but to the entire model of organized crime. If other communities adopted Bumpy's methods, if they started building institutional power instead of relying on street muscle, the traditional families would become irrelevant overnight. The phone call at 3:47 a.m. was to Vincent Chin Gigante, Geneviese's family's most trusted soldier and the man responsible for enforcing discipline in contested territories. Costello's instructions were specific. "We're changing our approach to Harlem. Effective immediately, we recognize Johnson's jurisdiction. No interference, no pressure, no attempts at integration. Harlem operates independently." Gigante's response was predictable. "Boss, that sets a precedent. Every neighborhood boss will think they can." Costello interrupted. "This isn't about precedent, Vincent. This is about mathematics. It costs us more to fight Johnson than we make from Harlem operations. And fighting him educates other communities about his methods. We contain by isolating, not by confronting." But the mathematics Costello referenced weren't just about immediate costs. In the 18 months since the families had been pressuring Bumpy's organization, they'd lost 7 significant operations to federal investigations. 3 major figures faced tax evasion charges. 2 important judges had recused themselves from cases involving family members. 5 crucial police contacts had been transferred to different precincts. Every time they moved against Bumpy, information about their own operations seemed to find its way into the hands of federal prosecutors. Every time they planned an operation in Harlem, they found themselves under surveillance by investigators who shouldn't have known about their activities. Fighting Bumpy Johnson wasn't just expensive in terms of manpower and resources, it was expensive in terms of exposure. The call lasted 23 minutes. By dawn, orders had filtered through every level of the 5 families. Harlem was off limits, not because of fear, but because of strategic calculation. But Costello's decision had implications he hadn't anticipated. Word of the Harlem arrangement spread through criminal networks nationwide. Within 6 months, community leaders in Detroit, Chicago, and Philadelphia were sending representatives to study Bumpy's methods. They weren't coming to learn about running numbers or policy operations. They were coming to understand how a single man had made his community untouchable through institutional power rather than street violence. The arrangement created an unexpected side effect. By recognizing Bumpy's authority over Harlem, the Italian families had accidentally legitimized a new model of community organization. Bumpy wasn't just running illegal operations anymore. He was functioning as an unofficial mayor, mediating disputes, organizing community services, and representing Harlem's interests in broader political discussions. When Mayor Robert Wagner needed to understand community sentiment about urban renewal projects, his staff didn't just consult elected officials. They quietly reached out to Bumpy Johnson. When federal investigators wanted information about civil rights violations by NYPD officers, they found that Bumpy's network had more accurate data than their own internal sources. The morning after Costello's call, Bumpy Johnson woke up in his Lenox Avenue apartment, unaware that his status had fundamentally changed. He read the New York Times, drank his coffee, and prepared for another day of managing Harlem's complex social and economic ecosystem. But by 10 a.m., when his phone started ringing with congratulations from contacts across the city, he understood that something significant had shifted. The first call came from Councilman David Patterson. "Bumpy, I don't know what you did, but every federal task force targeting Harlem operations got pulled back overnight. Whatever arrangement you made, it's working." The second call came from Detective Lieutenant Michael O'Brien, who managed police relations in Harlem. "Johnson, my captain got orders this morning. Any operations in your territory require special approval from downtown. Looks like you've got protection from the very top." By noon, Bumpy understood what had happened. Frank Costello hadn't just called off his soldiers. He'd made Harlem a recognized territory within New York's criminal geography. The implications were staggering.
For the first time in American criminal history, a predominantly black neighborhood had achieved independence from white organized crime families. Not through violence, not through deals, but through superior organization and institutional power. The arrangement held for over a decade. Even after Costello's influence waned, even after new families rose to prominence, Harlem remained untouchable. Bumpy had proven that community organization could be more powerful than traditional criminal muscle. When federal investigators later studied the Harlem model, they found something remarkable. Crime rates in Bumpy's territory were lower than surrounding areas. Violent crime dropped 40% between 1957 and 1967. Property crime fell even further. Not because of police intervention, but because Bumpy's organization provided what residents needed: economic opportunity, dispute resolution, and protection from both external threats and internal predators. Educational outcomes improved during this period as well. Bumpy's organization quietly funded scholarships for promising students, supported after-school programs, and provided job training for young adults. The same network that gathered intelligence and managed policy operations also identified talented youth and created pathways for legitimate success. Small business development flourished under Bumpy's protection. Restaurant owners, shopkeepers, and service providers found themselves insulated from both street crime and bureaucratic harassment. Permits got approved faster. Licenses were processed efficiently. Zoning problems were resolved quickly. The invisible hand of Bumpy's influence made legitimate business operations run more smoothly. The phone call that Frank Costello made at 3:47 a.m. on September 15, 1957, wasn't just about criminal territories. It was about recognizing a new form of power. Power that came from serving a community rather than exploiting it. Power that built institutions rather than destroying them. Power that created loyalty through mutual benefit rather than fear. Bumpy Johnson had accomplished something unprecedented in American criminal history. He'd made his community so valuable, so well organized, and so institutionally powerful that even the most ruthless criminal organizations found it more profitable to cooperate than to conquer.
Frank Costello understood what many still miss today. True power isn't about who you can control through fear. It's about who chooses to support you, because doing so serves their interests. Bumpy Johnson had built that kind of power, and once built, it became unbreakable. By morning, Harlem was untouchable, not because of guns or threats, but because a single phone call had acknowledged what was already true. Some communities become so well organized, so institutionally strong, that even criminals respect their sovereignty. The lesson of Costello's call resonates decades later. When communities organize effectively, when they build institutional power, when they create systems that serve their members' interests, they become forces that even the most powerful interests must acknowledge and respect. Bumpy Johnson never sought to destroy the existing power structure. He simply built a better one, and when he did, even Frank Costello had to make a call.